The smell of lye soap and wet stone rose from the temple floor in waves sharp enough to sting the eyes, and Sir Vale had been breathing it for 6 hours. 300 wolves filled the great hall of the iron sanctum behind the temple doors, their voices a low roar that shook dust from the rafters, and every one of them had tracked mud across the marble she had already scrubbed twice. She pressed the rag harder into the grout between the flagstones, her knuckles raw, her knees aching against the cold, and she did not look up. She had learned not to look up. The claiming ceremony happened once every 5 years. Alphas from every territory in the Northern Dominion traveled to the Iron Sanctum to present candidates for the lunar title. Women of noble blood, daughters of ranked families, she-wolves with lineages that stretched back centuries. This year 3 alphas had come with claims so fierce that the betting halls in the lower city had been taking wagers for months. Alpha Kalan of the Stone Peak Pack, whose candidate was his own sister, a woman said to have silver in her blood and iron in her teeth. Alpha Doran of the Blackfile Pack, whose daughter had been trained since birth in the old rites, could recite the 47 laws of pack governance from memory. And Alpha Brennan of the Ashfall Pack, whose mate candidate was so beautiful that 2 border wars had already been fought over her hand. 3 alphas, 3 women draped in silk and sapphire and ancestral gold. And behind the locked temple doors, on her knees with a bucket of grey water and a rag that was falling apart, Sarah Vale scrubbed the floor no one would notice. She was not a candidate. She was not even a guest. She was the temple ward, the girl the priests had taken in 11 years ago when her father, Lord Aldrich Vale of the Ridgeback Pack, had dropped her at the sanctuary steps like a sack of grain he no longer wanted to store. She had been 8. He had not looked back. She remembered the smell of his horse, leather and sweat, and the faint sweetness of pipe tobacco. And she remembered the sound of hooves on cobblestone growing quieter. And she remembered standing on those steps until the evening candles were lit, because she kept thinking he would turn around. He never turned around. Now she was 19, and her father was somewhere in that great hall with his real family, his wife, his son, his eldest daughter Lizelle. The golden one, the one who smelled of rose water and spoke in a voice like poured honey. Sarah had seen Lizelle once, 3 years ago, when the family had visited the temple for a solstice blessing. Lizelle had walked past Sarah without recognition. Not cruelty, something worse. Genuine blankness. Sarah had handed Lizelle a prayer candle, and Lizelle had taken it without seeing the hand that offered it. The temple doors groaned open. Sarah pulled her bucket closer to the wall, pressing herself against the stone column, making herself small. It was a skill she had perfected, the art of occupying space without claiming it. Footsteps poured through the corridor. Wolves in ceremonial armor, advisors in dark robes, servants carrying platters of wine and roasted meat. The procession flowed around Sarah like a river around a stone, not one pair of eyes dropping to acknowledge the girl on the floor. She kept scrubbing. The mud was fresh. It would take hours. Then the air changed. She felt it before she understood it. A pressure, a weight, a silence that spread outward from the far end of the corridor like frost across glass. The procession split apart. Walls pressed against the walls. Conversations died mid-syllable, and through the gap walked a man who bent the atmosphere around him simply by existing. The Alpha King. Kael Draven had ruled the Northern Dominion for 217 years. Sarah had heard the story since childhood, whispered by the temple priests after Vespers, traded by the servants who brought supplies from the city. He was the oldest living Alpha, the most powerful wolf in recorded history. He had not taken a Luna in 2 centuries, had not smiled in living memory, had not spoken more than 6 words at the last 3 claiming ceremonies before walking out and leaving the title unfilled. He was enormous. That was the word her body chose before her mind could intervene. Not tall, though he was that. Not broad, though his shoulders seemed to narrow the corridor simply by passing through it. Enormous in the way a mountain is enormous, in the way something ancient and immovable is enormous, something that does not need to prove its scale because everything around it has already adjusted. His hair was black, streaked with gray at the temples, and it fell past his jaw in a way that should have looked unkempt but instead looked deliberate, like a man who had stopped performing neatness for anyone's comfort. His face was hard. A scar ran from his right cheekbone to the corner of his mouth, pulling his expression into something that looked like permanent disapproval. His eyes were the color of hammered steel. He walked without hurry. His boots struck the stone in a rhythm that reminded Sirrah of the temple bells, steady, measured, inevitable. Two advisors flanked him at a careful distance. The woman on his left was tall and angular, dressed in charcoal silk. Her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. She wore 3 rings on her left hand, and her smile was the kind that never reached past the teeth. Lady Kestrel, head of the King's Council, the woman who had run the Iron Sanctum's politics for the last 40 years, while the king sat in frozen silence on his throne. The procession moved past Sarah. She pressed harder into the column. Her bucket was in the way, she realized too late. It sat 2 inches into the path of the procession, grey water sloshing against the wooden sides. Lady Kestrel's boot caught the edge of it. Water splashed across the stone. The advisor stopped, looked down. Her thin lips compressed into a line that could have cut wire. "What is this?" Sarah reached for the bucket. "I apologize, my lady. I will move it immediately. You will explain why a temple rat is cluttering the processional corridor during a claiming ceremony." The wolves around them had stopped. Sarah could feel their eyes, dozens of them, the weight of collective attention falling on her like a physical thing. She kept her voice even. "I was assigned to clean the floors after the first procession, my lady. The mud was tracked through, and the head priest wanted it cleared before the evening rite." The head priest. Lady Kestrel's voice carried the particular contempt of someone who has never scrubbed anything in her life. And the head priest thought a scrawny, wolfless ward was the appropriate presence for a corridor the Alpha King would walk through. The word wolfless landed like a slap. It was the word Sarah's father had used in his letter to the temple, the one the priests thought she had never read. "She is wolfless. Defective. I have no use for a daughter who cannot shift." "I will move," Sarah said. She did not apologize again. She reached for the bucket with steady hands. "Leave it." The voice came from behind Lady Kestrel. Low, rough, the texture of stone grinding against stone. Every wolf in the corridor went rigid. Draven had stopped walking. He stood 6 feet from Sarah, his steel eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made the air feel thin. Lady Kestrel turned, her practiced composure flickering for just a moment. "Your Majesty," the ward was simply. "I said leave it." He was looking at Sarah, not at the bucket, not at the mud, not at the advisor who just humiliated a girl on her knees. At Sarah. His expression had not changed. The hard line of his jaw, the scar pulling at his mouth, the pale eyes that gave away nothing. But something in his stillness had shifted. A predator who had been walking through the world on autopilot for 2 centuries had just registered something worth stopping for. Sarah met his gaze. She did not drop her eyes. She did not know why. Every instinct she had cultivated in 11 years of temple service told her to bow, to look away, to shrink. That something in the way he looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, made her spine lock straight. 3 seconds. It lasted 3 seconds. Then Draven turned and continued walking, and the procession swept after him like a tide following the moon, and Sarah was alone in the corridor with her bucket and her rag and the echo of something she could not name. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the wet stone until they stopped. Behind the walls of the great hall, the claiming ceremony was about to begin. Sarah picked up her bucket and carried it to the alcove where the cleaning supplies were stored. She wrung out her rag. She refilled the water from the cistern in the courtyard, and as she worked, she noticed something strange. The flagstones where the Alpha King had stopped were warm. Not from the torches, not from the bodies that had passed over them. Warm the way skin is warm, the way living things are warm. She pressed her palm to the stone. The warmth faded under her touch like a breath dissolving in cold air, and then it was gone. What no one in the iron sanctum knew, what the council had buried under layers of protocol and silence and careful misdirection, was that Cale Draven was dying. Not in the way of mortal wolves. In a slower way, a quieter way. The way a fire dies when no one feeds it and the coals have been cold so long they have forgotten what burning felt like. The curse had been laid 213 years ago by a woman named Vasara, a blood witch of the old lines. Kyle had refused her claim on his bond after the death of his first Luna, a woman he had loved with the particular ferocity of a young alpha who believed love was permanent. Vasara had expected the grieving king to turn to her. He had turned to no one, so she cursed him. First went warmth, not the concept of it, but the physical reality. His skin stopped registering heat. Fires burned in every room of the iron sanctum, and he felt none of them. He stood in summer rain and felt only the impact of water, never its temperature. Then went taste. Food became texture without meaning. He ate to sustain his body the way a man oils a machine, mechanical, joyless, necessary. Then went color, not all at once, but gradually like a painting left in sunlight, the vibrancy leaching out year by year until the world existed in shades of iron and ash. Then went emotion. That was the cruelest loss, and Vasara had designed it that way. Not the absence of feeling, but the inability to reach it. Cale could remember what joy felt like, the way an amputee remembers the weight of a missing hand. He knew the shape of it. He could not touch it. His wolf, the great black beast that had once howled so loud it shook snow from the mountain peaks, went quiet, not dead, quiet, curled somewhere deep inside his chest like an animal that had given up waiting for spring. 213 years of this. 213 years of sitting on a throne made of bone and iron, ruling a kingdom he could not feel, judging disputes he could not care about, watching generations of wolves live and love and die, while he remained frozen, untouched, a monument to a dead woman's spite. Lady Castrum knew. She had built her power in the vacuum of his emptiness, managing the kingdom with efficient precision, and if there were moments when she looked at the king she served and felt something other than ambition, she buried those moments the way she buried everything that did not serve her position. She had been 22 when she joined his council. She was 63 now. She had given her entire adult life to managing a kingdom whose king could not feel gratitude, and if some small part of her resented him, resented the frozen waste of serving a man who would never see her sacrificed, she had long ago decided that resentment was indistinguishable from loyalty if you performed it correctly. The evening of the claiming ceremony, the great hall blazed with firelight and smelled of roasted venison and pine resin and the sharp mineral tang of ceremonial incense. 300 wolves packed the hall. 6 alphas sat at the high table, and 3 candidates stood before the throne in gowns that collectively cost more than a border village earned in a year. Cale sat on the throne. His hands rested on the arms of the chair. His face held nothing. Alpha Kalan of the Stone Peak Pack presented first. His sister stepped forward in white silk, her silver hair braided with moonstone, and she knelt before the throne with practiced grace. She offered the king a blade forged from the ore of the Stone Peak mines, its hilt wrapped in wolf leather, its edge so sharp it split the torchlight into ribbons. Cale looked at the blade. He looked at the woman. He said nothing. Alpha Doran of the Blackfell Pact presented second. His daughter stepped forward in deep green velvet, a throat circled by a collar of emeralds, and she recited the 47 laws of pack covenants in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall. When she finished, she held out a scroll bearing the Blackfile Treaty of Allegiance, signed in her own blood. Cale looked at the scroll. He looked at the woman. He said nothing. Alpha Brennan of the Ashfall pack presented third. His candidate stepped forward in crimson and gold, and a murmur ran through the hall because the rumors had not exaggerated. She was staggeringly beautiful. She carried a chalice of ancient wine from the Ashfall cellars, 200 years old, priceless, and she offered it with a smile that had ended border wars. Cale looked at the chalice. He looked at the woman. He said nothing. The hall waited. 3 alphas stood rigid with barely contained anxiety. 3 candidates held their positions before the throne. 300 wolves watched the king who had not chosen a Luna in over 2 centuries. Then the doors at the back of the hall opened. Syrah had not intended to enter. She had been cleaning the corridor outside when the evening rite bell rang, and she needed to cross the hall to reach the temple kitchens where her evening meal, cold bread and thin broth, waited. She had planned to slip along the back wall, invisible, unnoticed, the way she always moved through spaces that were not meant for her. But the hall was full. The back wall was lined with wolves, and the moment she stepped through the door, every head in the room turned because they had been expecting the doors to remain shut, and the sound of ancient hinges screaming drew attention the way a gunshot draws silence. She froze. 300 wolves stared at her. Her dress was the rough gray wool of a temple ward. Her feet were bare. Her hands were red and cracked from lye soap and cold water. Her dark hair was pulled back with a strip of cloth torn from an old cleaning rag. She held nothing. She carried nothing. She was nothing, by every measure that mattered in this room. Someone laughed, then someone else. The laughter spread like oil on water. Not loud, not cruel exactly, but dismissive in the way that only collective amusement at the powerless can be. "The temple scrub girl," someone whispered loud enough to carry. Someone left the door unlatched. "Careful, she will wash the throne." Sarah's face burned. She took a step back toward the door. Wait. The hall went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The absolute absence of sound that only occurs when the most powerful person in the room speaks. And every living thing responds to the authority in his voice, like iron filings responding to a magnet. Kyle Draven was standing. He had risen from the bone throne without anyone seeing him move, which should have been impossible for a man his size, and he was staring at the back of the hall with an expression that made Lady Kestrel's hand tighten on the arm of her chair. His wolf had moved. For the first time in 213 years, the beast inside his chest had lifted its head. Not stirred, not shifted, lifted its head and opened its eyes and looked through Cale's own eyes at the girl in the grey dress with bare feet and soap-cracked hands and an expression that was not fear, was not submission, was something fiercer than both. Something in his chest began to howl. "Come forward," Cale said. The words left his mouth before he had decided to speak them. He felt them the way you feel a crack spreading through ice. Inevitable, structural, beyond the reach of choice. Sarah did not move. She stood in the doorway with 300 wolves between her and the throne, and the laughter still echoing in the rafters and her bare feet cold on the stone. "Your Majesty," Lady Kestrel said, rising smoothly, "the candidates have been presented. If you would prefer to deliberate in private, Nas roll. Come forward." Cal said again. He was not speaking to Lady Kestrel. He was not speaking to the room. His steel-grey eyes were fixed on Sarah with the intensity of a man who has just seen color for the first time in 2 centuries and is terrified that if he blinks it will disappear. Because color had returned, not fully, not everywhere. But the girl's eyes, brown, dark brown, the color of wet earth after autumn rain, were the first thing he had seen in 213 years that was not gray. Sarah walked forward. She did not know why. Every rational thought she possessed told her to run. That the voice that had called her forward was not the voice of a king issuing a command. It was the voice of something lost recognizing something found, and she could not refuse it the way you cannot refuse gravity. The crowd did not part for her. She walked through them, between armored shoulders and silk sleeves and the sharp scent of ceremonial perfume, and not one of them moved to make way. She walked the entire length of the great hall with her bare feet on cold stone and her rough grey dress catching on wolves who did not bother to step aside, and she did not stop until she stood before the three candidates in their silk and sapphires and ancient wine. She was shaking. She clenched her fists to hide it. Cale descended from the dais. The three candidates stepped apart, uncertain, their rehearsed composure cracking at the edges. Alpha Carlin rose to his feet. Arthur Brennan's hand moved to the hilt of his ceremonial blade. The Alpha King stopped in front of Sarah. She had to tilt her head back to look at him. Up close, the scale of him was disorienting. The scar on his face, the lines around his pale eyes that spoke of centuries without rest, the rigid set of his shoulders, as though relaxation was a language his body had unlearned. But his eyes were no longer steel gray, at the edges creeping in like dawn the faintest trace of silver blue. Color returning. "What is your name?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Sira Vale. Something fractured behind his expression. A sound built in his chest, low and raw and ancient. Not a growl, a recognition. Sarah Vale. He said it the way you say a word, in a language you thought you had forgotten. Slowly, tasting the shape of it, and every wolf in the hall felt the bond resonance pulse outward from the king like a shock wave, and three alphas who had come to claim the lunar title understood in that single moment that they had already lost. Alpha Kalen stepped forward. "Your Majesty, this is a temple ward, a wolfless girl without rank or bloodline. The lunar title requires my choosing," Cale said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "And I have not chosen anyone in 213 years. Until now." He reached up and removed the iron crown from his head. The sound it made when he set it on the stone floor, not on the throne, not on the table, on the floor at Sarah's feet, rang through the hall like a bell struck underwater, deep and resonant and final. Then he knelt. The Alpha King of the Northern Dominion, 217 years old, the most powerful wolf in the known world, knelt on the cold stone floor before a barefoot girl who smelled of lye soap and whose hands were cracked from scrubbing. The silence that followed was so complete Sarah could hear the torches burning. "I do not offer you a crown," he said, looking up at her. "I offer you the man beneath it, whatever is left of him." Sarah looked down at the king on his knees. She looked at the crown on the stone. She looked at 300 wolves who laughed at her 2 minutes ago and who now stood in frozen, disbelieving silence. She thought about her father dropping her at the temple steps. She thought about 11 years of cold bread and grey water and floors that needed scrubbing and the particular loneliness of being invisible in a building full of people. She reached down and placed her hand on his cheek. His skin was cold, stone cold, the cold of a man who has not felt warmth in over 2 centuries. But where her palm pressed against the line of his jaw, she felt heat build. Not from her, from him, as though something dormant beneath his skin was waking up, stretching, remembering. A tremor ran through his body. His eyes closed. When they opened, the steel gray had retreated further and the silver blue had spread, bright and startled, like ice cracking to reveal moving water beneath. "You're warm," he said, wonder in his voice, raw, unguarded wonder, the kind a man cannot fake. "I can feel that you are warm." The weeks that followed broke the iron sanctum open like an egg. Lady Kestrel fought it. She convened emergency councils. She cited precedent, 14 separate statutes requiring noble blood for the lunar title. She brought forward genealogists who confirmed that Sarah Vale had no traceable lineage of significance. She was meticulous, thorough, relentless, and she was not wrong about the law. But something was happening to the king that no statute could address. The maddening Emperor, the ceremony, the first rosebush in the fortress courtyard, dead for decades, put out a single green shoot. By the third day, the kitchens reported that the king had asked for salt on his meat. He had not tasted salt in 213 years. By the fifth day, the servants noticed that the fires in the great hall burned higher when Sirrah was in the room, the flames leaping and cracking as though responding to a presence that had been absent for centuries. Kyle fought it too, not the bond, to hope. He had spent 213 years learning to survive without expectation, and the return of sensation was not gentle. It was violent. It came in waves that buckled his knees and left him gripping the edges of tables with white knuckles, while his nervous system relearned the difference between hot and cold, rough and smooth, pleasure and pain. He pushed Sarah away, not physically, with silence. He stopped coming to meals. He locked the door of his study and sat in the dark and tried to will the cold back. Because at least the cold was familiar. At least the cold did not require trust. At least the cold could not be taken away because it was already nothing. On the 10th night, Sarah found his study door locked. She sat down in the corridor outside it, her back against the stone wall, and she spoke through the wood. "I am not going anywhere." Silence from the other side. "You do not have to open the door. You do not have to speak. But I am not going to pretend that what is happening to you is not real just because it frightens you." More silence. Then very quietly, the sound of a body settling against the other side of the door. The wood was thick, but she could feel the vibration of his weight against it. They sat like that for an hour. 2. She talked sometimes. About the temple. About the way the courtyard smelled in early spring when the frost melted off the stone and the moss released that green mineral scent. About the priest who had taught her to read and the way he always smelled of ink and wool, and the particular patience of a man who had chosen kindness as a discipline rather than a temperament. At some point the door opened, not all the way, a crack, wide enough for her to see one pale eye rimmed with silver blue looking down at her. "You are not afraid of me," he said. "No, you should be. The curse is not broken. It is cracking, and I do not know what comes out when it breaks. Then we will find out together." His jaw worked. She watched the muscles in his throat move as he swallowed something that might have been pride, might have been fear, might have been the accumulated weight of 2 centuries of deliberate isolation. He opened the door the rest of the way. He did not invite her in. He simply stepped aside, and she walked past him into the dark study, and she sat down in the chair by the dead hearth, and she waited. He sat across from her. The silence was not empty. It was full. Full the way a held breath is full. "My wolf is speaking," he said. "For the first time since the curse. He keeps saying the same word." What word? Home. Lord Aldrich Vale arrived at the Iron Sanctum 3 weeks after the claiming ceremony, uninvited, with Lizelle in tow. Sierra watched them from the upper gallery as they were escorted through the courtyard. Her father looked older, smaller. His riding coat was dusty and his boots were scuffed, and there was something in the way he held his shoulders that suggested a man carrying a weight he had not anticipated. Lizelle walked beside him in blue silk. She looked nervous. Her golden hair was pinned up in an elaborate style that must have taken hours, and she kept touching it as though checking that it was still there. The audience was held in the great hall. Cale sat on the throne, and for the first time in centuries the iron crown was not on his head. He had not put it back on. It sat on a wooden shelf in Sarah's quarters, next to her cleaning rags and the chipped ceramic mug she had brought from the temple. She had not asked for it. He had not offered it formally. He had simply carried it there one evening and set it down and walked out, and neither of them had discussed it. Lord Aldrich knelt. The movement was stiff, unpracticed, the knee of a man who had not bowed to anyone in decades. "Your Majesty, I come to recognize the bond between yourself and my daughter." Cale said nothing. His hand rested on the arm of the throne. His eyes moved to Sarah, who stood to the right of the dais in a dress of simple dark blue wool. Not silk. She had refused silk. "Your daughter," Kyle said slowly, "whom you left at the temple steps when she was 8 years old." Lord Aldrich's composure cracked. Not dramatically, a tightening around the mouth, a shift in the eyes that looked, for one brief moment, less like political calculation and more like a man confronting the specific weight of a specific failure. It passed quickly, but Sarah saw it, and she filed it away in the part of herself that had spent 11 years wondering whether her father ever thought about the sound of his horse's hooves growing quieter on the cobblestones. "I made errors in judgment," Lord Aldrich said carefully. "You made a child sleep in a temple when she had a home," Cale replied. His voice was quiet. Quiet was worse than loud with him. Everyone in the room knew that. Lizelle stood behind her father. Her hands were clasped. Her rehearsed composure had dissolved completely, and what remained was a young woman who looked overwhelmed and uncertain and, to Sarah's surprise, genuinely distressed. She kept glancing at Sarah with an expression that was not hostility or envy or disdain. It was the bewildered guilt of someone who has just realized they were standing on another person's air hose and never thought to look down. Sarah stepped forward. The hall held its breath. Father. It was the first time she had spoken to him in 11 years. The word felt strange in her mouth, like a key to a lock she had changed. "I received your letter." She had received 3 letters, in fact. The first, arriving a week after the ceremony, had been formal. The second, arriving 2 weeks later, had been less formal. The third, arriving yesterday, had contained a line that Sarah had read 4 times. "I do not ask you to forgive what cannot be undone. I ask only that you know I did not forget. I convinced myself it was kindness. It was not. Sarah." His voice broke on her name. Something real moved through his expression. Something that cost him. She looked at him. She looked at Lizelle. She looked at the hall full of wolves who were watching her with the particular attention of people who expect a spectacle of vengeance and vindication. She would not give them that. "You may stay for the evening meal," she said. "We can speak. I will not promise more than that." Lord Aldrich bowed his head. It was not the practiced bow of a politician. It was the unsteady bow of a man who had expected to be turned away and did not know what to do with mercy. That night Sarah did not sit with her father. She sat with Merrin, the old housekeeper, who had been the first person in the iron sanctum to speak to her without deference or pity, who had simply handed her a cup of tea that first morning and said, "You look like someone who has been surviving. Would you like to try living instead?" The curse broke fully on a Tuesday. There was no dramatic moment, no burst of light, no ancient words spoken under a blood moon. Sarah was in the kitchen garden, pruning the rose bushes that had exploded into riotous growth over the past month. Thorny and wild and covered in blooms, so red they looked almost black at the edges. Her hands were dirty, her sleeves were rolled to her elbows. She was humming a hymn the temple priest used to sing during evening vespers, off-key because she had never been able to carry a tune. Cale came around the corner of the garden wall and stopped. She did not see him at first. He stood in the archway with the afternoon sun behind him, and he watched her, and something in his chest completed a process that had begun the night the barefoot girl walked through a hall of wolves without flinching. The last thread of the curse dissolved. He felt it go, not with pain, with exhaustion, the sudden bone-deep weariness of a body that has been clenched against absence for 213 years finally letting go. Color poured back into the world, not gradually, all at once. The red of the roses, the brown of the earth, the green of the leaves, the blue of the sky, sharp and vivid and so beautiful it made his eyes sting. He made a sound, not a word, a sound that contained every sunrise he had not been able to see properly, every meal he had not been able to taste, every fire he had not been able to feel, every laugh that had died in his throat before it could form. Sarah turned. She saw his face. She dropped the pruning shears in the dirt and crossed the garden in 4 steps. And when she reached him, he pulled her against his chest so hard she felt his heartbeat through both their clothes. It was racing, hammering, a heart that had beaten mechanically for over 2 centuries suddenly remembering what it was for. "The roses," he said into her hair. His voice was wrecked. "Sarah, the roses are red. I had forgotten that roses were red." She held him. She did not speak. She pressed her face into his chest and breathed in the scent of him, pine and cold stone, and something warm underneath, something new, something that had not been there a month ago. His wolf howled inside him, full-throated and enormous and alive, the sound reverberating through the bond between them like a bell struck true for the first time. And deep in Sarah's chest, answering it, her own wolf opened its eyes, stretched, lifted its head, and howled back. She was not wolfless. She had never been wolfless. The wolf had simply been waiting for something worth waking for. Kyle pulled back. He cupped her face in his hands, both hands, his scarred fingers gentle against her jaw, and he looked at her with eyes that were no longer steel gray. They were blue, clear, bright, winter morning blue, full of something so raw and unguarded it made her breath catch. "Stay," he said, not a command. The word had no authority in it. It was a question dressed as a statement, the kind of vulnerability that costs a man everything, especially a man who has spent 2 centuries making sure nothing could cost him anything ever again. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I already told you that through a locked door." He laughed. It was rough, unpracticed, a sound that scraped out of his chest like a machine starting after years of disuse. But it was real, and it was the first laugh the walls of the Iron Sanctum had heard from their king in 213 years. She kissed him in the garden with dirt on her hands and rose petals in her hand, and the late afternoon sun casting long golden shadows through the archway. It was not gentle. It was the kiss of 2 people who had spent their lives in different kinds of cold and had finally found the same warmth. Outside the garden wall in the corridor that led to the great hall, Lady Kestrel paused. She had come to deliver a council report. She heard the sound through the stone, not words, but something worse. Laughter. The king's laughter, a sound she had spent 40 years in his service and never once heard. She stood very still for a moment. Her hand rested against the wall. Her face held an expression that no one saw, and it was not anger and it was not jealousy, though both of those lived in it. It was the quiet, exhausted grief for the woman who had given her life to holding something together and had just realized that holding was not the same as healing, and she had never known the difference because no one had ever asked. She straightened her shoulders. She folded the report. She walked away. In the courtyard below, the rose bushes climbed the fortress walls, thorny and defiant and blooming so thick the grey stone had begun to disappear beneath them. The first frost of autumn was weeks away, but for the first time in 213 years the fires in the Iron Sanctum burned without being lit. The stones held warmth. The corridors carried the scent of bread baking and pine and the particular indefinable smell of a place that has decided, against all evidence, to become a home. Kale's wolf howled from the highest tower at dusk. The sound carried across the mountains and down through the valleys and into the border territories where wolves who had not heard the Alpha King's voice in generations stopped what they were doing and listened. It was not a summons. It was not a warning. It was joy. Pure, enormous, unmistakable joy. And in the garden below, Sarah Vale, Temple Ward, the Spare, the wolfless girl, Luna of the Iron Sanctum, stood among the roses with dirt on her hands and listened to her mate's voice ring across the world, and she did not cry. because she had stopped crying years ago, but she smiled, and the wolf inside her chest pressed against her ribs and hummed. So where are you listening from tonight? I would love to know. Drop it in the comments and tell me what moment in this story hit you the hardest. Was it the crown on the floor? The locked door? The roses? Let me know. And if this one kept you listening past your bedtime, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next tale. I will see you in the next one.